It is the spring of 1941, and somewhere in the shimmering heat of the Western Desert, a British Army officer is doing something that has no business being in a war. He is standing before a group of bewildered generals, holding a set of mirrors. His name is Jasper Maskelyne. He is 34 years old. He is not a soldier by training, nor an engineer, nor a scientist. He is a magician, a stage illusionist from one of the most celebrated conjuring families in British history. And he has just told the commanders of the Eighth Army that he can make their tanks vanish. The generals look at one another. Some smile. A few roll their eyes. One, it is said, simply stared at the man for a long, silent moment before asking, "How?" It was a fair question. The war in North Africa was going badly. Rommel's Africa Corps was tearing across Libya with terrifying efficiency, and the British were desperately short of everything: men, materiel, and, most critically, the element of surprise. German aerial reconnaissance was extraordinarily thorough. Luftwaffe pilots flew low over the desert every morning, photographing British positions with meticulous precision. By afternoon, those photographs were on Rommel's desk. By evening, his guns were trained on whatever the British had tried to hide. No camouflage net, no dispersal pattern, no painted canvas had yet fooled them. The desert, it turned out, was a dreadful place to try to hide. There were no trees, no hedgerows, no convenient hills behind which to conceal an armoured regiment. There was only flat, sun-baked earth stretching in every direction, and a sky that gave nothing away. And yet somehow, on the eve of one of the most consequential battles of the entire North African campaign, an entire harbour full of ships, a fleet of tanks, and tens of thousands of men would be made to appear to be somewhere they were not. And the man responsible would be a conjurer from London, who had spent his career making elephants disappear in theatres. How on earth did it happen? And why did the Germans never figure out what was happening to them? To understand what Maskelyne was offering, you first need to understand just how desperate the situation had become by the middle of 1941. The British Army's conventional approach to battlefield deception had been, to put it charitably, uninspired. Camouflage units existed, of course. Paint was applied to vehicles. Netting was stretched over gun emplacements. But the Germans were not being fooled, and the losses were mounting with grim regularity. The problem was not effort. The problem was imagination. Military camouflage at that point was designed to help things blend in. To make a tank look like a rock, or a supply dump look like sand. It was defensive thinking. It asked only, how do we hide what we have? Maskelyne was asking an entirely different question. He was asking, how do we make them see what isn't there? This distinction sounds philosophical until you understand what it means in practice. A hidden tank is still a threat. If the enemy suspects it might be there, they will search. A fake tank, on the other hand, draws fire, consumes reconnaissance resources, and most importantly, draws the enemy's attention precisely where you want it. Maskelyne called this the other side of the coin. You did not simply conceal reality. You manufactured an alternative one. He had, after all, been doing exactly this on stage since childhood. The Maskelyne family name was synonymous with British stage magic. His grandfather, John Neville. Maskelyne had performed at the Egyptian Hall in London's Piccadilly for decades, and his father Neville had continued the tradition. Jasper had grown up in the mechanics of illusion, understanding how the human eye and human expectation could be exploited, how attention could be directed and misdirected, how a person could be made to believe something impossible simply through the careful control of what they were allowed to observe. He had volunteered immediately upon the outbreak of war and had spent 2 frustrating years trying to convince a skeptical army that these skills had military application. He had given demonstrations at the War Office. He had made a destroyer disappear in the Thames using mirrors and lighting rigs. He had shown how a man in a field could render himself effectively invisible using nothing more than a simple angular reflector. The army had been politely unimpressed until, with the Desert War turning critical, someone finally decided to let the conjurer have his chance. The unit Maskelyne assembled in Cairo became known informally as the Magic Gang, though its official designation was the Camouflage Experimental Section. The men he gathered were, by the standards of military bureaucracy, an improbable collection. A painter, a chemist, a cartographer, a set designer from the London stage, and a former puzzle maker from Yorkshire. They were given a workshop in Heliopolis, on the outskirts of Cairo, and a budget that was, by the accounts of those involved, extremely modest. What they produced, however, was anything but modest. Their first major achievement was the creation of what Maskelyne called the Sun Shield, a device that, from the air, made a tank look like an ordinary 3-ton lorry. The principle was straightforward, but the execution was ingenious. A lightweight, collapsible frame, roughly 6 meters long and 2.5 meters high, was constructed from tubular steel and canvas. When fitted over a tank, it gave the vehicle the unmistakable silhouette of a supply truck. The frame could be assembled by 2 men in approximately 8 minutes and disassembled in roughly the same time. The canvas was painted in the pale ochre and faded khaki of standard desert transport. To the naked eye at ground level, the disguise was obviously unconvincing. The proportions were not quite right. The bulk gave it away. But from 3,000 feet, through the lens of a Luftwaffe reconnaissance camera, it was indistinguishable from a lorry park. The companion device was even more audacious. The Magic Gang produced a dummy tank, a full-scale replica constructed from canvas stretched over a frame of wire and bamboo that could be carried on the back of an actual lorry, deployed in minutes, and would, on a reconnaissance photograph, appear to be a real armored vehicle. The dummy weighed approximately 40 kilograms. A real tank weighed around 30 tons. One man could pick the dummy up and carry it over his shoulder. Hundreds of these devices were manufactured in the workshops at Heliopolis. The production rate, at the height of the program, was estimated at roughly 40 units per week, though the exact figures were never formally declassified. The operational use of Maskelyne's devices reached its defining moment in October and November of 1942, in the weeks leading up to the Second Battle of El Alamein, the engagement that would, ultimately, break the Africa Corps. General Bernard Montgomery's plan required one of the most elaborate deceptions in military history. The actual attack was to come from the north. The Germans needed to believe it was coming from the south, and to achieve this, the Magic Gang was given a task of almost surreal ambition. They were to create, in the southern desert, the illusion of an entire army that did not exist. A fake pipeline was constructed, 11 miles of dummy water pipe, laid in full view of German aerial reconnaissance, but laid at a rate deliberately calculated to suggest it would not be complete until after the actual attack had already begun. This misdirected German planning accordingly. Fake supply dumps were assembled near the pipeline. Thousands of dummy ammunition crates and fuel containers, some real enough to photograph convincingly, arranged to suggest a massive southern buildup. In the north, where the real attack was being prepared, the situation was reversed. 200 real tanks were fitted with sun shields and disguised as lorries. 1,000 genuine supply vehicles were arranged in patterns designed to look like nothing more threatening than routine logistical traffic. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is the best way to make sure you see these stories when they come out. Soldiers reported that the effect on enemy behavior was measurable. German artillery in the south was repositioned. Panzer reserves were held back from the northern sector. When Montgomery's attack came, on the night of 23rd of October 1942, it struck precisely where the Germans had been persuaded it would not. The German approach to battlefield deception, it should be said, was not without its own sophistication. The Wehrmacht had camouflage officers embedded at divisional level, and the Afrika Korps in particular had developed considerable expertise in using the desert terrain to their advantage. Rommel himself was known to study British deception attempts with professional interest. But the German system was, at its core, conventional. It was oriented towards concealment rather than misdirection. German dummy positions tended to be static installations, fake gun emplacements, false headquarters, rather than dynamic, theatre-scale illusions designed to manipulate enemy decision-making at the strategic level. They hid things. They rarely invented things. The American approach to deception in North Africa, when the United States entered the theatre in late 1942, was broadly modelled on British doctrine and incorporated many of the techniques Maskelyne's unit had pioneered. The American 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later famous as the Ghost Army for their operations in Europe, owed a clear intellectual debt to the principles of misdirection and manufactured reality that the Magic Gang had been practicing in the desert for 2 years. What set the British approach apart was precisely the theatrical thinking at its heart. Maskelyne understood something that military engineers generally did not: that deception is not primarily a technical problem. It is a psychological one. The question is not what you build. The question is what the enemy believes. The actual historical impact of Maskelyne's work has been debated with some vigor by military historians, and it is worth being honest about where the record becomes uncertain. Some accounts, particularly Maskelyne's own memoir, published in 1949, credit him with achievements that later researchers have struggled to fully verify. The precise contribution of the Magic Gang to Alamein's outcome, as distinct from the contributions of conventional intelligence operations, signals deception, and the overall superiority of Montgomery's planning, is genuinely difficult to isolate. What is not in dispute is that the deception operation at El Alamein worked. German reserves were in the wrong place when the attack came. The dummy pipeline and the false southern buildup succeeded in misdirecting German planning at a critical moment. Whether Maskelyne himself deserves the lion's share of the credit, or whether the organizational apparatus around him, particularly the officers of the A-Force Deception Unit under Dudley Clark, was the decisive factor, remains a legitimate historical question. What is clear is that the philosophy Maskelyne embodied, the idea that a war could be partly won by controlling what the enemy saw, believed, and expected, became central to Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. Operation Fortitude, the vast deception operation that convinced the Germans that the D-Day landings would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, was the direct descendant of the thinking first operationalized in the North African desert. The ghost armies that never existed, the phantom divisions that filled German intelligence reports, the fake commanders and invented order of battle, all of it traced its lineage to the same insight: that the most powerful weapon in the arsenal might not be the one that fired, but the one that made the enemy fire at nothing. No surviving examples of the original sunshield frames are known to exist in museum collections, though photographs of them in use can be found in the Imperial War Museum archive. The dummy tanks, never built to last, long since returned to canvas and wire. Return then to that moment in the spring of 1941. A magician standing in front of generals, holding mirrors, telling them he can make their tanks disappear. Think about what he was really offering. Not a technical solution, but a shift in thinking. He was asking the most powerful army in the British Empire to accept a truth that felt, to professional soldiers, almost embarrassing: that the outcome of battles could be shaped not just by the quality of your weapons and the courage of your men, but by the stories you told your enemy about where you were and what you intended. It took time for the army to accept this. It took failure in the field, and mounting casualty lists, and the particular desperation of a campaign that was not going as planned. But eventually, they listened. And when they did, a man who had spent his career making things vanish before audiences in Piccadilly turned his attention to the Libyan desert and helped make a victory possible. The tanks did not disappear, of course. Not really. They were always there, crouching beneath their canvas skins, waiting. The illusion was not that they were gone. The illusion was that they were somewhere else entirely. And in war, as in theatre, the difference between where something appears to be and where it actually is can be the difference between life and death, between defeat and the turn of the entire tide. Jasper Maskelyne won no Victoria Cross. He received no knighthood. He emigrated to Kenya after the war and spent his final years running a driving school in Nairobi, a fact that somehow seems entirely appropriate for a man who spent the war making things appear to be other than they were. But he left behind something the army had not possessed before he arrived: the understanding that in the right hands, a mirror and a canvas and a willingness to think like a conjurer could be as decisive as a regiment of tanks. Sometimes the most powerful thing in a soldier's arsenal is not what he shows his enemy. It is what he makes his enemy believe he cannot see.